right, thank you. So, see, that's not too loud, is it? Okay. So I really appreciate everyone being here. I'm excited because we are about to start a new year, and so it's a perfect time to be thinking about the future. And my talk today is on Atheist Seminary. If we're going to have atheist churches, it stands to reason that there will be atheist seminaries. And the easiest way to learn about something or to think about something that we've never even thought about before is to compare and contrast it with something that we do know something about. So we do know something about Christian seminary, and that is sort of the context that I'm going to put our talk about atheist seminary. So in 2012, Elaine de Botton wrote a book called Religion for Atheists. And in this book he argues that the atheists should not spend time debating whether or not God exists, that argument has already been pretty much won. And what we now should focus our attention on is, well then, what comes next? And I will still say what I said in 2012, which is Elaine de Botton is living in Europe. I don't think we can be that cavalier in the United States, right? And and around the world, right? There are still 53 countries where you can be jailed for blasphemy, and 13 where you can in fact be put to death. So we can't take it for granted that atheism has won, but since we are imagining the future, I always say I'm not imagining a future without Christian churches. It's just there are 880 churches in the greater Seattle area, and I would like to have at least 80 of them or so be atheist churches. You can go to your local atheist church. So in 2015, we founded Seattle Atheist Church to answer that question of what comes next. Elaine de Botton says that the reasons that people invented religion still exist. We still have those same anxieties and yearnings. And basically, religion is here to answer some big questions. And so I want to talk about how the religion of atheism answers those big questions and sort of contrast them with the Christian answers. By the way, I lost my talk, so I'm feeling really anxious as I stand up here because I'm kind of having to go off memory. But as Kathleen pointed out, I'm here among friends. I shouldn't be anxious, but there it is. I'm feeling a little like, I lost my talk.
You got it.
Okay, I got this though. Thank you. Okay, so the first big question is, how did the world get here? And how do we know, right? And so for a Christian, God is the creator, and we would spend time contemplating the fact that God, the creator, is also a personal, intervening, and supernatural God, right? And God is also the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost simultaneously. And there are, you spend a lot of time really thinking about what does it mean to have God the Father. And it is Athanasius, of Alexandria, who was the theologian responsible for the pushing the gospel, not the gospel, but the theory of God, the Trinity, right? And we also, if you're a Christian, then you believe that the Bible is still today the authoritative Word of God. And so in the book that I read, the Portable Seminary, they caution, there's 70 different theologians, and they're all sort of cautioning thinking too much of the Bible as like a historical document, because that's the way, that's the way to lose your faith, basically. And that you should, in fact, interpret the Bible through faith, and that's how we know the really important stuff. So obviously, we here at Seattle Atheist Church, we talk a lot about developing our capacity for critical thinking. And the first thing is that humans should not assume that critical thinking, that we're all doing it. Like, we think we're doing it, but actually it's a capacity that has to be developed. And so some talks that we've had, like the operating of your meatware, is one of the best talks that we've had. And if you see it up on the, to choose, please let's try to get that one some more. And also there is a person whose name is Victor Stenger, who is a particle physicist. He holds 3 different professorships in different sciences. He was also a philosopher. And he wrote a book called The God Hypothesis. And that's an important book for atheists to read. I haven't read it yet. But even Christopher Hitchens, points to this book as like a very definitive, answer to the God hypothesis. And of personal interest to me is the fact that Victor Stenger was concerned about a new sort of religion, which was people using quantum mechanics in kind of new, spiritual, making quasi-scientific religions. And he argues, against that. Like, we as scientists have to stand up and prevent that from happening. So it seems like that's an important thing, for us to know about. So what does it mean to be human? And then as part of this sort of, am I worthy? Am I loved? Am I forgiven? So you can thank Augustine of Hippo for really developing the idea of original sin, right? I'll get back to that in a minute. I didn't mean to lead with that. What I wanted to lead with, which is a really important, good stuff in the Bible, and that I hope they will emphasize more in seminaries, is the idea that God is created that man is created in the image of God. And if you have a belief that God is a loving God, then this is really good. And it means that human beings should love one another because we're created in the image of God, and also that we have the capacity for decision making and for making change, basically carrying out God's plan, right? So that's like really important stuff to think about, like what would that mean if you believed that there was a God, right? Now, the unfortunate thing, which I feel like is at least as pushed in Christian churches, is the Doctrine of Original Sin. And you have Augustine of Hippo to thank for that one. But don't worry, because God intends salvation of all people through Jesus, which is also himself. And although you are broken and unworthy, and broken is the word that Emma and I heard recently when we went to speak with some people in a church. We are broken, but God will forgive you, and yes, you are loved. Okay, now I want to speak as Ruth on this. I think that this whole thing is, there's something so resonant about this need for forgiveness, and that's why this whole thing of the Christ story has lasted so long. So I would like to answer this with the work of Alice Miller, who was a psychologist who talked about how it's our early childhood traumas which basically cause us to have that broken feeling, to feel abandoned, to feel vulnerable, to feel unworthy. And so then the question is, but are we forgivable? And again, we had another super great talk at Seattle Atheist Church about how do we do forgiveness without reliance on the concept of God. And that has to do with accepting responsibility for our actions, making plans to avoid the thing from happening again, making amends if possible. And so again, that's a great talk. That was the same person. If you see that talk up again, I would really highly recommend it, because I think trying to speak to that question of that need for being forgiven is a huge reason why Christian churches exist, right? Okay, now the question is, what does it mean to live an ethical life? So if you are Christian, then the thing is we lead an ethical life through obedience to God. We partly discover that through faith. We partly discover that through the Bible. It gets a little complicated because the Bible is, parts of it are 3,400 years old. And fortunately for us, people actually don't follow the Bible, right? There's a lot of stuff in there, and we just we don't follow that. We don't not mix meat and cheese. There'd be no lasagna, there'd be no cheeseburgers. We don't consider it a sin to be raped in a city, for example. That's one of the admonitions, don't get raped while you're in a city. And we could go on sort of about those things. We do sometimes, we limit it to about once a year, so I'll try not to do it. Because we know that people's sense of what's right and wrong is somehow separate from this Bible. Otherwise, you wouldn't know what parts of it are silly and what parts of it aren't, right? And things like, there's information there on genocide and how to keep slaves and all of that. So how do we, there's not much in it. Like if you're an atheist and you read a book like Ethics in the Real World by Peter Singer, he lists, over 80 ethical dilemmas that are relevant to us today, right? All kinds of things having to do with biotechnology or the factory farming of animals. And what do we owe sort of like this planet that we're on? And the question is how, you're not likely to get the answer from that, from the Bible, right? So I kind of at first made a list of all these different things that we talk about in here. We talk about utilitarianism, we talk about Kant, we talk about, but also, so in his book, The Portable Atheist, Christopher Hitchens collects together a whole bunch of readings which he thinks are essential readings for an atheist. And one of the arguments is that even literature can give us insight into human nature and some of our dilemmas that we're facing. But Peter Singer recommends that we read Derek Parfit's book On What Matters. That book, the first half of it, it's 1,500 pages, but it's the first 400 pages that I'm talking about here were published in 2011. And in that book, he makes the claim that there are objective truths. That it's one of the claims is sometimes against atheists is that you just kind of do whatever you feel, that there is no objective truth. Now, the one thing about our church is we are actually dedicated to not making decisions for people, but rather for teaching people the skills of critical thinking or promoting that as a value. And we, I would imagine that if you were going to be an atheist seminary and you were going to teach somebody to be a minister, that Derek Parfit's On What Matters would be required reading, right? The other thing I want to back up on the question of what is human nature from an atheist point of view, again, we are as a church community, we are just now kind of learning all these new things and synthesizing these new things that we're learning. So we just recently had a talk on Martin Seligman's book, Virtues and Character Strengths, and that's another really thick book like this, which I keep at work to kind of read a little bit at a time. But it talks about the 7 virtues and 24 character strengths that these positive psychologists have identified as what's the best of humankind and how do we know and what research has been done and what can we do to promote those things. And that seems critically important for an atheist church, if you're thinking about what should we be reading, what should we be possibly working on, in terms of if you're creating a seminary. And so, let's see. Okay, how do we find meaning and purpose? If you're a Christian, that is to obey God. And if you are an atheist, you have to find and create meaning and purpose for yourself. And so to that end, it's not an easy answer. Churches provide practices and rituals that support us in our life transitions. What I would like us to be doing is very intentionally, and we are very intentionally gathering resources that can be used for weddings, for funerals, readings, all of that kind of good stuff. And Elaine de Botton says, don't be shy about dipping into 3,400 years worth of human history. Like, all that stuff is fair game for atheists too, because it's very resonant, right? So please, someone read Ecclesiastes at my funeral, that kind of thing. My funeral. I give you permission. Okay, and also churches provide community and events for their members. Churches provide, another word I'm probably going to mess up, numinous, or a sort of sense of the sacred. And de Botton says, look, there's centuries worth of music and poetry and architecture and art. It all still belongs to us because we are human, and as part of our humanism to enjoy those things. But also in his book, he gives like examples of where they've actually taken the architecture for like the St. Paul's Basilica and then turned it into a reading room somewhere else, or some church and then turned it into a museum somewhere else. And I gave a talk once about, how many cells could fit in a grain of sand, and that each individual cell has like 300,000 moving parts. So for a sense of what is really awe-inspiring, we certainly don't have to like make anything up. We can look to share those experiences together by just, as we find out these really cool things, share them. And then the last thing that if you are studying in a seminary that you learn about not only running a church, but there's really a big section on missionary work. And it was really interesting. In seminary people like learn foreign languages for the purpose of studying the Bible or for purposes of going to do missionary work, and learn a lot about like how you would do that. And the closest thing that I can think of is Peter Boghossian's work on atheist street epistemology. And I had like read that book twice, and then recently for this was watching his YouTube videos, and it was like it took me until this time for it to kind of click. I don't know why that is. There is something to be said for the teacher appears when you're ready, right? And it was such good stuff. And I'm like, this guy, is he in Portland? I think he might be in Portland, and we might be able to bring him as a speaker if that was a goal for the church. But interesting to kind of learn that idea. Somebody asked me once about how do you convert your non-Christian, your non-atheist friends to atheism, and I sort of started off the talk with like, why would you even want to? But at the same time, especially when you're talking about fundamentalists who have some really unhelpful positions, I think it would be awesome and might be a good skill for those of us who might be interested to learn from Peter Boghossian. So that is my talk on imagining the future, where we have atheist seminary, the same as we have Christian seminary, and where we have a religion for those who are interested. As I always say, you don't have to have a religion if you're an atheist. But you also, by the way, don't have to belong to any church if you're a Christian. But if you like this project, there were some thoughts to kind of get us started in the new year, and really, I would say, in the new 5-year plan, thinking about. Thank you.